very much, Philip, and hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining this, and a special Bula Vinaka to anyone in Fiji who's showing real dedication because it's 5 o'clock in the morning there. So welcome if anyone's listening from Fiji or the South Pacific. As Philip just explained, I was really fortunate in having the opportunity a year ago to spend 8 weeks on secondment with the National Trust of Fiji. I went there very much with an open mind about what I would be doing. It was obviously going to be heritage related, landscape related, but I didn't really have any knowledge of what the challenges would be. So after I arrived there, it was pretty clear actually on literally my first day at the National Trust offices of what some of the challenges might be. In this picture here, in the top left, you can see number 3 Ma'afu Street, the headquarters of the National Trust of Fiji, and a very large tower block being built right behind it.
Depending on which country you're in, you can actually...
And if you see in the photograph top right, they're the government buildings in Fiji, very important historic buildings. And in the top left, you can see just what an impact that new tower block is making. And bottom right, how it looms over the original sort of older bungalows in that part of the city. So I thought, yeah, there seems to be a bit of a challenge here in terms of a spatial approach to heritage and planning generally. And further discussions with the director of the National Trust confirmed that. And so we thought that a really good idea perhaps for a workshop would be to look at heritage character assessment. And I was very clear that my role was in sharing knowledge and facilitating and mentoring rather than actually going to work for the trust. So it was very much about sharing. So we arranged a workshop, and here we all are gathered at the archives building. It was spread over 2 days, and we had about 20 or 30 local participants who were heritage professionals, planners for the city council, for the government, National Trust staff, a wide range of people, but we very much approached it from the point of view of this being training the trainer. So we wanted to share knowledge and share expertise so that participants could then go away and share that in turn with their own organisations. So the approach I followed was very much based on a character assessment toolkit developed in the UK relating to Oxford, and that is easy to find online and is a really valuable resource for anyone who's involved in this type of work. Just a bit of context here. Fiji, an archipelago of over 300 islands in the South Pacific. So I'm a geographer, as Philip said, so there has to be a map. And the main island, Viti Levu, is where the capital is, Suva, and the former capital is on a smaller island, Levuka. So a very diverse country. Homing in now on Suva itself. Suva is on a peninsula, and this map actually has marked in purple the protected buildings in Suva, which you can see grouped here. And in fact, the 3 red boxes are the study areas where we identified for the workshop that we held. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about character itself and what is character. And Philip has given a really useful introduction. And in Fiji, it's very important to tell stories. And I started with this little story about this place in the picture. And this is a village called Worley, which is very special to me. And it's special in a number of ways. It's special because it has a range of historic buildings, from old stone cottages to a historic abbey. It's got a special landscape around it, but there's a lot more to it than just the buildings, and even just the buildings and the landscape setting. And some of the things that are special are particular memories I have, like the hill at the back in the background here. The hill is called the Nab. I used to walk up there with my father. We used to stop at an old farmhouse and buy a special drink called sarsaparilla that was made locally. And the smell, there was a particular smell. This village is in the northwest of England, so it's wet. It often rains. And there was a very characteristic smell of wet stone paving slabs and the smell of soot from coal fires that people were burning. Whenever I smell that particular smell now, it takes me straight back to this particular village, Worley. And we all have places that are special to us, and it's this mesh of all the different ingredients working together that actually constitute character. And what I'm going to be talking about, and what the workshop in Fiji was based on, is trying to actually analyze character and break it down into the different components and assess them to some extent in terms of quality as well. What is good, what is bad, what is indifferent. And why is it important to assess character? Well, people are very strongly rooted to their places. That's very common, and it's important that that's respected, particularly in decision making, for example, in planning. It can be positive and it can be negative, the different elements. For example, this piece of wall art or graffiti, this will cause different reactions to different people, as it will everywhere. So again, it's not just about what is good and what is bad, but more what is positive or negative. And there will be many subjective judgments. And the big word, the big P word, potential. It's really important when assessing character not to look at the superficially at what is in, for example, good condition and what isn't, but to try and look beyond that and think, well, okay, it might not be all that great at the moment, but how could it be improved? What's the potential here? And some examples here, in fact, not Fiji, but a lot closer to home in the UK. This is actually on the island of Jersey in the Channel Islands. And the two photos on the left here are buildings which, if you were walking around St Helier, the main town of Jersey, you might think, oh, this is a really scruffy area. No, it's not got very good character at all. But both of those buildings have now actually been renovated by the National Trust for Jersey and are now the pride and joy of the town and the island, actually. And the building in the top right is now a thriving cafe and very much the centre of the community. So how do we go about assessing character? I'm going to concentrate mainly on the workshop and hopefully give you a really good impression of what the workshop participants were looking at and the sort of things they were concentrating on as they walked around Suva just over a year ago. But it is important that character assessment is set within a context and isn't just an exercise in its own right. So it's important to undertake research, especially beforehand, some historical development research, and in fact afterwards as well. The whole geography and landscape of the place that you're assessing is important. And then how do you define the study area? Well, to do that, you have to start really with an idea in your head about what is a special area. There needs to be some sort of reason why you home in on a particular area. And it's probably because it's a more historic area or an area where people congregate that's important for various reasons. It's important also that you actually keep that study area live in terms of being open to change the study area. For example, in Suva, we had the 3 areas that were shown on the earlier map. But by the end of the 2-day workshop, people were saying, actually, there's more than that. We need to expand those areas. And as people went around, their eyes really did open much wider in terms of what they considered to be special about their city. And that brings us on to stakeholders and culture. And this is a really important aspect. who's doing the character assessment and who's it for and who's involved. And what I think is most valuable is to have a cross section. And at the workshop in Suva, we had a mixture of mainly local professionals, but some visitors like myself. And that was so valuable because we had the insight from the local people who knew the background, who could remember what places were like in some cases 50 years ago, who were very aware of the local culture, what is important to local people. But on the other hand, sometimes it can be someone from outside an area who can actually open people's eyes wider. I'd be just the same in my own village. If a friend from Fiji walked around my village with me, I'm sure they would see lots of things that I don't notice because I go around every day and I'm just used to it. And then lastly here, the purpose and the outcomes. I'm going to keep going back to character assessment not being an end in itself, and I'll talk more about that at the end, but it's important to be reasonably clear about why you're doing the work, and so often it's the foundation for other work that can head off in all sorts of directions. So moving on to character itself now, you can break character down into 5 main elements. So the spaces, the buildings, the views, the greenery and the landscape features, and the ambience. And I'm going to go through all of these 5 and break them down into detail with lots of examples, good and bad. So firstly, the spaces. So space is formed by a gap between built elements or different landscape features. And it's so important that the character of a place does not just depend on buildings, on the built form, but on the spaces between them. And of course, they vary so much. They can be formal or informal. They can be laid out, planned deliberately and specifically, or just happen. The gaps between the buildings are really important. On the left here, we've got an example actually from Oxford, where there's a very deliberate architectural ploy here that you go through quite a narrow gap between buildings, a very narrow street, and then suddenly it opens up into a square with an amazing building in the middle. The middle picture in Fiji, one of the characteristic sites in Suva to me was looking through the gaps between the buildings and seeing on one hand the tropical vegetation, and also, if you can see here, seeing the ocean in the distance. As I mentioned, Fiji's Suva is on a peninsula, and so you're never far from views of the sea. On the other hand, the gap between buildings can just be somewhere to chuck the rubbish. So it really makes a big difference to the character of the place. The means of enclosure, walls, fences, gates, good examples here of the good, the bad and the ugly, makes a big difference. And enclosure can be defined, for example, by water or by changes in level. And the photo on the left here is of an ancient village site. It actually falls within Suva, within the metropolitan area. It's a ring ditch fortification site. And so the ditch with the water in here is actually very, very important historically in defensive terms and culturally. And on the right, one of the water courses that passes through Suva, again creating a sense of enclosure, being accentuated by the building next to it with its historic arcade, unfortunately now filled in, but you can imagine what it would have been like to have walked along that arcade next to the water. Building plots. Now, the pattern of building plots is a very important element of character. It can be organized, it can be haphazard, it can be uniform, it can be varied. The streets themselves are an important element of the space aspect of character. We've got a classic example here in Paris, the Champs-Élysées. And then in Suva's sort of equivalent of the Champs-Élysées. And these 4 photos actually show another element in terms of how the space can change as you move along it. So in the top left-hand corner, we've got the main street, the main road in Suva, but out of the city centre up towards the the president's house, and you've got the sea on this side, the president's house set behind the botanic gardens here. And it's quite low key. As you move on along that road, you pass some grand historic buildings and a very formal park on the right. And then as you approach the city centre, it gets more built up. And then the same road right in the city centre. And actually something else to note here is another difference between these two bottom photographs. It just shows how character can actually change depending on the day or the time that you're studying it. So on the left, the photo on the left was taken on a Sunday, and in Fiji, everything shuts on a Sunday. It's an important day of rest, a day to go to church. And that is very, very clear if you're walking around a town or a city on a Sunday. On the bottom right, however, busy weekday and a cruise ship is in, so the busiest that Suva gets. And that again has an impact on character. Wide open spaces, well, the top right, the formal part that we saw the edge of in the photo just now. And I'll be coming back to different views of that because it's a very important public space and it's very imposing because of the size of it. And this is Fiji, so I couldn't not include a rugby ground. And then moving to narrow enclosed spaces. Again, these can be haphazard. They just develop through accident and become communication routes. Or they can be more deliberate. They can be winding, or they can be straight. On the left here, we've got a narrow winding street in Oxford. And on the right, a winding street in the commercial part of Suva. And in both cases, you know, what's around the corner? That's what's so interesting. What's around the corner? What is there? I think the Suva scene, that's accentuated by the colonnade and the gallery that sort of, you couldn't not go around the corner to see what's there. On the other hand, a straight street can be just as imposing. The relationship of buildings and structures to the space around them varies enormously. In this case, in Oxford, the Radcliffe Camera, the open space is minimal. It's all about the buildings. And in Suva, the photo on the left, the government buildings again, that's all about the building there, very imposing. Although as you move back across that formal park next to it, the open space becomes imposing. And then in the photo on the bottom right, you can see that clock tower, which is so significant. But just on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see the large tower block that actually I was talking about right at the start. And you can see how that is actually taking attention away from the clock tower. Uses and activities play a very big part in the character of an area. And these two photos actually are of the same building complex, the same government buildings, but on the left we've got a monthly market taking place and suddenly it comes alive. On the right, a quiet Sunday again, people are at home and that space then becomes very formal, very dignified, very state-like, which of course is what it was designed to be. The impact of traffic and vehicles in terms of where they are, where they go. I mean, in most towns and cities, we can't really get away from it now, and the impact that traffic makes. And the usability and accessibility of spaces is important. So how easy is it to walk around? That can really add or detract from your enjoyment of a place and really affect what makes it special or not. Going down to the details of paving materials, I mean, there are some extremes here, all from a similar area where some thought has been put into using the local cobbles to make a very attractive pavement here. And then the brick pavers, okay, not so bad, but it can quite easily sort of literally fall apart. Street furniture and signage can be very characteristic. I think many of you will recognise the traditional British pillar box here. And the street furniture is so important in terms of the quality, the design, where it's placed. It's not always bad. I mean, there are two signs here, and the one in the bottom right with a little roof on, I think is a really attractive sign, and I would say actually adds to the character there. On the other hand, this large advertisement hoarding, which is a video screen, so it moves, and is obscuring one of the most important historic buildings in Suva, the Carnegie Library. And it was interesting seeing what people's approach to this was when we did the character workshop and we were out in study groups in the city centre, and how many of the participants said, wow, I haven't actually noticed it before. And then they couldn't stop talking about it in terms of why does it have to be there? You know, can't we move it? So things that you just are used to on a daily basis, it's really worth stopping and taking the time to look hard and think, especially if you're involved in the future of a place and ways of actually making it more attractive. Moving on to buildings now, very important element of character. Although I said it's not all about the buildings are in a way the sort of skeleton. We're all familiar with what buildings are, and such an important angle is not just individual buildings themselves, but the way that buildings relate to each other and to the spaces around them and to the landscape around them. And this was very much a focus of the workshop in Suva, was looking at the settings of buildings and thinking about character in a spatial sense rather than in a specific building's sense. In Suva, in Fiji at the moment, the approach to historic building preservation is very much building specific individual protected buildings, and there isn't a spatial and area-based approach to conservation. For example, no conservation areas, apart from the World Heritage Site of Levuka, the old capital. So what is it about buildings that makes them characteristic? Well, the size and scale of them. Is there a uniform scale and size, or is it variable? And does this add or detract from the character of an area? Here's a fairly extreme example here of one of Suva's historic buildings with two more modern blocks behind. In this picture, actually, it doesn't look too bad. In practice, when I was there, I remember the tall buildings as being far more imposing, and I think that's certainly the case here. And this is a good example of how important it is to stop and think, especially in planning. Think about the height of buildings and the juxtaposition of different heights and what works and what doesn't. The age of buildings, very important, are how old are they in general? Is there a combination of different ages, or are they fairly homogeneous in age? Can you see the historic development of architecture through the ages? And we're not just talking about important landmark buildings, but buildings that might be hidden in another part of the town, might be around a corner that haven't really been noticed. And in some of the small buildings in Suva, there are a lot of colonial style bungalows that still remain. And these are particularly in the area around the government buildings. But none of them are actually protected individually. So the protected buildings are very much the landmark, larger buildings. And I'll be talking about it a bit more at the end when I'm talking about the outcomes of the workshop. Materials. So when analysing the character of a space, is there much homogeneity about the building materials? What is characteristic? What is more innovative? What works, what doesn't? And breaking these elements down into the building materials, windows, doors. And then moving on to the use. I've included Big Ben here, because this just screams Parliament, government. As in Suva, the Parliament buildings likewise expressed the use that they were designed for and the purpose for which they're still used. And of course, that doesn't always last. But the history of a building and the use for which it was designed is important. This building, St. Stephen's in Suva, was a boarding house for the Suva Boys Grammar School, and is very fondly remembered by many local people for that purpose. It's crying out for a new use, and a use that would be sympathetic to its design. And the design has already been compromised to some extent, because you'll have seen in some of the photographs I've shown the characteristic architectural detail in Suva, which is of the verandas and galleries and arcades. And in some buildings, like with this one, the first floor galleries have been filled in. And that again affects the character. Thinking yet about uses, this is another building in Suva. In fact, we have two historic buildings here. The one on the left is an old hotel, which is a protected building. The building at the end of the street here is known as the Lilac Theatre. It's not a protected building. However, it's very important to people because it's where they used to go to the cinema, it's where they used to see shows. And when we did the workshop, that actually was considered to be one of the most significant buildings because of the associations and the fond memories people have with it and its detail. So it's a building that really is worthy of conservation and protection. Condition of buildings, this is an important element. But as I explained earlier on when I was talking about potential, it is important to think about the potential of a building, and the beauty with buildings, beauty is certainly more than skin deep. And this is a building in Suva, the Grand Pacific Hotel, which on the left, as you can see, until fairly recently was a derelict ruin and was very, very nearly demolished. In a beautiful position opposite the government buildings and the big central park, and then backing onto Suva Bay. And fortunately, it was brought back into use and fully renovated under the guidance of the National Trust of Fiji, and is now the jewel in the crown of the South Pacific, actually, rather than even just Fiji. And people are rightly very proud of that. Two buildings here, the one on the left has been beautifully renovated, and the one on the right, a very similar building, but at the moment is in a fairly sad state, and really crying out to be renovated. There's so much character in Suva. And this is a building that I showed earlier when I started to talk about potential, and it looks a mess, and it would be easy to write this off just as a mess and, you know, mark up this part of the city as being really not much character, not good character, a negative element. But if you look at the building, it's got such strong characteristic features here, and it could be a stunning building. It was originally built as a hotel, the Metropole Hotel. So wouldn't it be nice if it was brought back into its original use? And some buildings are. This building was literally uncovered whilst I was in Fiji and has been really renovated very, very carefully. As has the Regal Cinema, no longer a cinema, but the facade has been kept. And I just couldn't resist including this picture of another cinema on the island of Taveuni, very close to the international date line, which is now empty and crying out for a sympathetic new use. The details, they do matter so much, and it can't be helped if air conditioning is needed. But again, it's an important element to look out for when assessing character. Views are so important. Views into a space, views out of the space. On the left here, we've got another scene from Oxford, where your view is concentrated along this street to the lovely spire. and then back to Fiji, where the clock tower of the government buildings can be seen from around the city. And then thirdly, the view out of the city between the buildings across to the sea. And this is just a few pictures I'm going to show of some views that I loved when I was in Suva. And it shows how a view can change as you pass through it. So walking down the hill from the National Trust offices down towards the city centre, this lovely view of Suva Bay and of the hills on the opposite side of the bay. And as you walk down the hill, the distant view comes and goes. The bay gets closer. And of course, the view changes at different times of the day. So in the evening, the hills seem to feel even closer, and that overall landscape setting that Suva sits in is such an important part of its character. And it's always there. You keep seeing it, despite the busyness of the scene in front. You know, what's striking here is the bay and then the rainforested hills beyond. And over on the island of Ovalau, the former capital Levuka, the World Heritage Site, again, you've got the forested hills as a backdrop here to the buildings. And the same on another island, on Vanuatu, the little town of Savu, where there's a very pronounced ridge that runs along behind the buildings of the town. And the views out to the backdrops such as this are so important, but also the views from the higher areas back across the town. In this case, out across the bay. Greenery and landscape features themselves an important element of character. Is it a leafy, lush green space? Or is it more built up? These two examples are both European. We've got Oxford again on the left, and then Salisbury in southwest England on the right, built up spaces. And then in Suva, some built up areas that are important meeting places, but have a different sort of character. And then the presence of water, and another important element. On the left, we've got a scene from Manchester in northern England, where the canals in the city had some years ago got into a very poor state, polluted, smelly, and the buildings very much turned their backs on the water, whereas now many of the buildings are being renovated and open spaces being opened up facing the water. On the right, we've got a waterfront in Suva. And again, a similar thing has happened. Some areas are opened up, some haven't, but this is such an important aspect of character and actually analysing what the potential is. So here on the left, we've got the sea. Suva is a port. And on the right, we've got Savu, also fronting the sea. Doesn't the weather make a difference, by the way? But on the left, much of Suva really turns its back on the sea. And this is one of the main outcomes of the workshop, was an assessment of the potential of the waterfront and how that could be improved to make that part of Suva so much more attractive and appealing. And enjoyable. This is back to Savu, but I love this picture because it just shows how people just quietly sit and enjoy that waterfront scene. It's part of their daily lives. Topography. Is the land flat? Is it sloping? Is a town or city on a hill, or is it in a bowl? This is Bath, the World Heritage Site city in the United Kingdom, where the hills that surround the city are so much part of it. And in Fiji, we've already seen a number of photos where the hills are very prominent. And there's another one here on the right is a little town called Singatoka, where, as you can see, development is starting to creep up the hill and will very much change the character of the town as it does so. And then the ambience of a place, as we've heard, it's not just about the buildings and the individual components, but how it feels. And is it quiet? Is it noisy? Is it active? Is it tranquil? This is the main central market here in Suva, which, as you can see, a lot of this is temporary structures. And when it's market day, an incredibly busy place, that is its character, that is creating its character. But of course, when the market isn't there, the character completely changes. Noises. At the start, I was talking about the little village in northern England and what makes that village special to me. And one of the aspects that I always remember when I think about it is the sound of the rooks. And a rookery, a very noisy, raucous bird, which makes a very characteristic sound. And sound is an important aspect of character. The obvious traffic noise that it's so hard to get away from. The commercial parts of towns and cities can be really noisy, and there are a couple of streets in Suva where there are a lot of clothing shops, and it's a very noisy area, and it's interesting. It's something I've reflected on actually, especially since I came back from Fiji. I remember walking around that part of Suva, and there were these huge loudspeakers playing very loud music. And at the time I used to think, oh my goodness, it's so noisy. I wish they'd just turn the noise off. And yet now when I think back to that, I can actually remember the characteristic beat of that music. And it has somehow become part of the character of that part of Suva to me. And then the minor birds, well, you'd love them or hate them. And the fruit bats, again, a very, very local source of noise. And again, this is where subjectivity creeps in. You love them or you hate them. Some trees in Fiji are specifically protected because they are fruit bat roosts. In other cases, the trees are removed because the fruit bats are noisy and smelly. And smells, again, they can be good, they can be bad. Do they matter? Well, this is an interesting example, actually. This is in Suva, and it's this is taken on a Sunday, which is why it's so quiet, but it's actually the fish market. It backs onto the creek that was in one of the earlier photographs. And being a fish market, it is very smelly. The point is that it's actually on the main walking route between the cruise ship port and the historic centre of Suva and the walkway down to the government area. So a lot of visitors pass right by this, and it's not a pretty sight and it doesn't smell good. So actually elements like smell can matter, and a potential enhancement here would be to try and relocate it and actually repair this building. As another historic building here. This could actually be made very, very attractive. So it's something to think about. Historical and cultural significance is such an important part of the character of a place, and it can be obvious and marked as such. It can be less obvious. The photo in the bottom left here is of the Ringditch fortification village, for which I showed a photo earlier. The one on the photo in the bottom right, again, looks a bit of a mess, but is actually a blocked up war tunnel. There was a network of defensive war tunnels were created in the Second World War. In the end, they weren't actually needed because Fiji wasn't invaded, but they're now actually becoming much more talked about and are really featuring as something very special in Suva's history to people who may have been service personnel in the war, may have actually worked in those tunnels. So elements like that can gain much more significance over time. And then finally, in terms of the different elements of character, this element that sort of brings it all together and can be summed up in the spirit of place of an area. And when we held the workshop in Suva, at the end of the workshop, we asked the groups, after they'd finished their field work and when they came back together in their 3 groups, each group had studied a different area, and we asked them all to think about what the overall overriding character was of their area and how could they sum that up in just a few short sentences or bullet points or descriptive words. And it was fascinating to see what came through that. It really crystallized what for them was special. And it wasn't just about the buildings, it wasn't just about the spaces, it was about all the elements knitted together. So moving on now to think a bit about recording character. As I've said a number of times, character assessment isn't just an end in itself, it serves a purpose. And so for it to serve a purpose, it needs to be recorded somehow. At the workshop, the groups had forms that they filled in as they went around, which broke down character into all the different elements that I've just taught us through. And they did have to make some judgments, some of which were subjective, some of which were neutral. They also recorded this on maps and they took photographs, and also character can be recorded in a descriptive way. So this is one of the maps that one of the study groups produced, and it was very interesting how they had focused in on different areas and they had sort of naturally gravitated towards heading towards an outcome, which I'll talk more about in a minute, but they actually saw their study area as a walk through. They literally walked through and concentrated on this route, which to them summed up the historical development of that part of Suva and what was special about it. And they ended up in the area that they have circled here, which is, I showed in one of the slides earlier, it was the one with the building at the end that was the Lilac Theatre that wasn't a protected building, and the building on the left that was a protected former hotel building. And that area is not the sort of prettiest or best kept part of Suva, but to them it was so special. It had a really strong character, and they felt that it had lots of potential. The buildings had potential to bring them back into more sympathetic and appropriate use, potential to carry out sympathetic restoration, and generally tidy the area up. And they could then see how that fitted into perhaps a heritage trail or something, or a heritage guide that could be featured in. So I'm not showing any more examples of maps because there are so many different ways of recording character graphically, and none of them are right, none of them are wrong, none of them are best, none of them are worst. But at the end of this, I've got some links through to some resources, and if you are doing a character study, there are lots of examples on the internet of historic area assessments, character assessments that show the different ways that it can be shown graphically. And of course, with GIS now, there is so much potential to do this. But in terms of the overall summary and planning implications, so at the end of the 2-day workshop, the 3 study groups were already automatically thinking, so what's next? And that was so important, and it was so valuable that they saw the assessment of the character of the areas as very much a starting point. And they were thinking about, was there a strong case for an area-based approach to conservation? And their resounding view was yes, there was a very strong case in Suva for a conservation area or multiple conservation areas. They were thinking about whether any additional buildings should be given individual protection. And again, this was a clear yes. Some important buildings like the Lilac Theatre, like the Holy Trinity, the Anglican Cathedral, not a protected building, but also some of the smaller, more workaday or residential buildings that are remaining in a pretty unspoilt way and could so easily be lost. They're thinking about the scope for enhancement and how that might be achieved. What would it take to bring some of the empty buildings back into use? What would it take to encourage sympathetic conversion rather than redevelopment or unsympathetic changes? How could planning policy be changed to respond more to the character of the city in order to preserve and enhance that character? And what could this mean for planning and for heritage protection in Suva going forwards? I'm pleased to say that the team back in Suva have been working hard. They've had a very challenging year, as has everyone. Here we are still in the midst of a global pandemic, and Fiji's economy has been hit very hard. But the National Trust out in Fiji have a team that are looking at Suva and are taking forward the character assessment work to work on a heritage trail. And they're thinking ahead and thinking about the post-COVID times and the times when tourists come back to Fiji, the cruise ships return to Suva, and how the character assessment work that they've done and that they've learnt about from their colleagues who attended the workshop could be applied to come up with a heritage trail, and that could perhaps become a Queen's Jubilee walkway, Commonwealth walkway. How about producing a guide to the history of Suva, to the protected buildings, historic buildings of Suva? Lots of ideas. So I've included a few links here to some UK examples. I don't actually have any other international examples of character assessment. It's something I would actually be very interested to hear if anyone does know of any. So I've included my contact email, and do feel free to contact me if anyone has any, particularly any examples of character assessment or any questions you think about in due course. But that's all from me for the moment. Thank you very much, Vinaka, and I will certainly be interested and keen to answer any questions if anyone has any. So thank you very much.
Karin, thank you. That was a terrific talk. I'd like to sort of throw it open now for questions. Rather than submitting them through the chat box, I don't know if you could turn your cameras on and we can then actually just put your hand up if you want to ask a question, or if all else fails, simply speak up and unmute yourselves. Any questions? Oh, people slowly appearing. Karin, I have to say that's the only character assessment I've ever seen that features fruit bats. I thought that was wonderful.
That's what I had done as well.
But can I just got a couple of questions. I mean, the study teams that you actually mobilised to do this, were they volunteers, or were they people already engaged in the built environment?
We're all engaged in the built environment or heritage. So it was, we actually had a working group to organise the workshop and put a lot of thought into who we could invite, because we were limited to about 20 people. I wasn't there for long, and then I was disappearing back to the UK. So we had a number of them, 3 or 4 were National Trust staff. We had a couple of government planners, 1 or 2 from Suva City Council. We had academics from the University of the South Pacific and Fiji National University. We had other government staff from the Department of Heritage. We had the president of the Fiji Planning Association. So we very much invited people that we hoped would be able to go and then spread the word, if you like, and share the knowledge that they had gained. It was very much a train the trainers and capacity building approach. But yes, they were all employed in
Anybody keen to ask? Mr. Fox.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi there, thank you. I'm Mike Fox from Nash Partnership. I was lucky enough to do a bit of similar work a few years back in Zambia, not heritage focused. I was based within government, the central province in Zambia, working for VSO for 2 years, trying to build capacity in their planning system there. And it was very interesting to see lots of similar things happening there as well. And I think their approach to conservation there is very similar to what you've described in Fiji, whereby I think they have a national conservation body and they're very much focused probably on a few monuments and a few buildings, and that's about it. And there is no real mechanism for building conservation into the planning system and thinking about it more spatially and how it can create better urban design and places with a much stronger sense of character. And you are seeing it really erode the character of lots of their towns and cities, and it's a real shame. So I think there's a real deficit there, and you're seeing it in other places at probably to much more extreme levels, like in Nigeria, for example, where I've also done some work. And I think there the problem you have is the attitude is all about modernity and wanting, and that their perception of what is kind of a good city and the city of the future is somewhere like a Dubai. And it's a real concern, and you're seeing, I think, what somebody called Vanessa Watson's referred to as African urban fantasies coming up and sprouting out of the landscape, or not, as the case may be, because there isn't really the capacity to do that. But that is what, in people's minds, is the ultimate, and it's quite frightening, really, what's happening to the indigenous culture and the how it's encapsulated within the landscape. So it's probably more of a comment rather than a question, but I think it resonates very much with what's happening in Africa, and I think it is an area of work that really needs to come to the fore much more in planning work generally there.
If I could just pick up on that, a really, really interesting point. And actually, I think what I would add is that the lack of a spatial approach to conservation actually happens much closer to home as well. So, for example, Jersey, where I've also been helping the National Trust there, Jersey has listed buildings, as we do in the UK, but does not have conservation areas. Not yet. They're referred to in the island plan, but they haven't actually designated any. And that's a big issue on the island. Going back to Fiji and your comment about the sort of the Dubai copies, very interesting and very actually topical in Fiji. I was invited with 20 minutes notice, I have to say, to a meeting in Fiji with the government, and a plan was unveiled, which was a future master plan for both the wider Suva and the wider Nandi, the town at the other end of the island, the wider Suva and Nandi areas. And in relation to Suva, plans have been drawn up by Singaporean architects, and the Suva one is a new city on the mangrove swamps with a 50-year plan. I'm struggling to see that will ever happen, and I hope it doesn't. Mangrove swamps, for a start, are a very, very fragile environment, but it's more than a Dubai. And as you can see from some of the pictures, there are real challenges with the economy and in finding the resources to protect the buildings. And also, I'm interested by your comment about the attitude towards architecture. And yes, that was apparent in Fiji. I mentioned in relation to one or two of the photographs about the traditional galleries, verandas. And of course, the buildings historically were built like that for a reason, and it was ventilation. A hot, steamy climate here. And there is still pressure to enclose some of those verandas and install air conditioning, there is pressure to knock down some of the historic buildings, even some of the protected ones, and build sort of 5-story plate glass office blocks, relying on air conditioning in a city with a very unreliable power supply. So it's very, I think, very interesting when thinking about sustainable development going forward, and about the different attitudes around the world, and as to how we can try to get the message across that actually, you know, keeping historic buildings in their original uses and restoring them and looking to the past for good ways of building sustainably in different climates is so important.
Sorry, if it's okay to just come back on that as well. I just think an indigenous architecture is really a really important thing to learn from as well, and a lot of the really important sort of cultural landmarks in somewhere like Zambia or Nigeria, a lot of them won't be in the built form, or they won't even be that tangible. And it's also thinking about how that's encapsulated and represented within the built environment as well, I think is really key, because obviously we tend to think of, probably quite naturally think of the last couple of 100 years and look at lots of the buildings, and there's lots of similarities with our buildings, but actually, you know, there's thousands of years of history that went before that, and thousands of years and layers of culture that have built up that had nothing to do with us, that I think also needs to be reflected as well.
Well, I don't want to leave that comment. Nobody responding to that. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, one of the purposes, if you like, of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum is to actually share experience and expertise across the Commonwealth about all aspects. It's not just about the European connections. It's about actually all aspects of the heritage of the countries of the Commonwealth. And so many of these problems that we're talking about recur again and again in countries around the world, and everyone tends to deal with them in their own little silo instead of sharing some of the solutions. And that's part of the purpose of these webinars and some of the work we're doing. When I wind up, I'll tell you a bit more about what we're doing before the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in June with other Commonwealth bodies as well. So, Francis, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, I was really wondering whether there's any appetite amongst either the people you worked with in Fiji or the people from government in developing more effective legislation to protect the urban environment and the heritage features within it and the conservation.
Yeah, the politics are interesting out there. There is an appetite, there's certainly a need. And as I think is common in a lot of Commonwealth countries, the planning legislation and the heritage legislation are based on British legislation circa 1964. And yes, the government themselves know that there is a dire need to update the legislation. I think the big problem is well, there are two big problems. Firstly, who does it? And secondly, what do you update it to? And we've just been talking about sort of the pull between, on one hand, the desire for a modernist, shiny new city approach, and on the other hand, a traditional approach building on the making the most of the historic fabric and honouring that. So I think there's a bit of a dilemma in terms of what the legislation would be changed to. And at the moment, obviously, with the economy being in the position that it's in, I don't think much progress is being made on that front. But the National Trust in Fiji are actually the government's official advisors. They are the government's agency for heritage, but obviously they're just one voice.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's quite comparable to what we've seen in some other Commonwealth countries as well. And there may be an opportunity to develop a collective approach, which a forum like ours can help advise or promote across many jurisdictions.
I think one thing that is I mean, you can't escape from in Fiji is how far they are from anyone else. I mean, yes, Australia and New Zealand are relatively close and are closely connected in terms of engaging, but certainly I found that there was a huge appetite for sharing and learning and for imbibing knowledge. And it was two-way. I was very conscious from the start when I arrived that I was there to learn as well and would take away as much as I had given, if not more.
I think Cynthia, I was trying to ask a question, if she's still there.
I really apologize. Sorry
Yeah,
about
there we
that.
are.
Thank you.
Oh, right.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Is there, over here in India, in Calcutta, which is where I am, one of the reasons why there isn't any change in legislation, though we know that it's required, is because of the real estate pressure. So there's a very strong lobby acting against changing the legislation, which is practically quite ineffective. Is there any such? Is it just apathy, or is there any very strong lobby like that, or pressure like that, which is preventing change?
I don't think that there isn't strong pressure to change legislation, certainly from the general public's point of view. The relatively small number of people who are involved professionally, like the professional planners and the heritage professionals, are very keenly aware. But I think really at the moment it's more of an economic issue. It's a lack of resources is huge. Not just lack of resources in terms of the money to fund the work, but actually the lack of people to do it as well. And the Fiji, I mentioned the Fiji Planning Association, which is a very new professional association, has about 20 members out of a pool of about 50, I think, qualified planners in Fiji as a whole. They just don't have the people, and they don't have the money, certainly not at the moment, least of all at the moment, to bring in the expertise to do it for them. And I think also, I mentioned the politics, and I did start to get drawn into, I did start to get some insight, shall we say, into some of the politics, but I'm sure that many of you watching are only too aware that politics can be the deciding factor.
Karin, can I just ask you a follow-up to that? Because I'm just conscious, I think the Prime Minister of Fiji spoke very eloquently about the importance of sustainable development at various international meetings. And experience elsewhere suggests that trying to secure a political champion for the idea of sustainable development and conservation is often the key to unlocking the problem. And I just wondered, does that look like it might happen in Fiji? Is that person a potential champion?
Well, Fiji has Suva has about 40 protected buildings. And at the moment, 3 of those protected buildings are under threat of demolition or near demolition, actually for government-related purposes. So I think there's a lot of push and pull within the government itself and different priorities.
Okay.
So the legislation is in place to protect them, but the practice, economic, or what is perceived to be economic necessity, can lead to other decisions being made.
Which is a very common problem, yeah. Anybody else want to ask a question? There we go. Anybody else's hands up anywhere? Right. Shall we draw the session to a close? I mean, Karin, thank you very much indeed for a really thorough understanding of character appraisal and all of the different facets that aspects it involves. And I hope in some way it's widened people's understanding of how we all can do this essential work and engage with and mobilize local communities to help us. Sorry, I lose my voice here. Karin, thank you for that. We look forward to working with you much more closely on our potential pilot project in Fiji. If any of you are interested in the pilot projects under our Commonwealth Heritage at Risk initiative, then please join us. Our role and goal is to save endangered heritage of all types across the Commonwealth and to cultivate and foster a better understanding of people's local heritage and the heritage that local communities value. As far as future events are concerned, I mean, prior to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in June in Rwanda, we are actually working very closely with the Commonwealth Association of Architects, the Commonwealth Association of Planners, engineers, and other professional Commonwealth bodies on an integrated series of 5 talks on really pressing current challenges from things like post-COVID recovery to the capacity gap of skills across the Commonwealth. So there'll be these 5 talks, and as part of this, the Commonwealth Heritage Forum will be leading a presentation and panel discussion on the conservation challenge on Thursday, the 29th of April, which will be the next event in this series. So please keep an eye out for details on our website. Details of the other talks in that series with our partners will be posted on our website as well. And then of our own volition, we'll be running our own series of more Commonwealth Heritage Forum talks starting in late May. And the first of these will be on the conservation of the Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries at Imphal and Kohima, the site of the sort of epic battles which turned the tide of the Second World War in the East, which are absolutely extraordinary places. And details of that talk will be circulated in advance to all of our members and also posted on the events page of the website. We really welcome feedback on the talks and also ideas for others. So if you personally are keen to deliver one yourself on setting out your experience and involvement in some of these issues, please step forward. Or just if you just want to discuss or suggest some topics that we could cover, then please let us know and we'll try and get speakers to do that. But thank you very much indeed for joining us. Hope to see you again on the 29th of April. And once again, thank you, Karin, for an absolutely terrific talk. I don't know if we can't really clap, but as before, show hands of appreciation. But yeah, there we are. Thank you. Thank you, Karin.